I want to welcome all of our returning listeners to another Provident webinar, and also welcome our first-time listeners. I'm hopeful all of you will continue to join us. I'm Ed Mann, the Director of Training and Education for Provident. I'm pleased to have as our guest tonight, Alex Mayer from the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health as part of the Center for Disease Control. Alex will tell you more about himself in a few minutes. However, before he does, I want to offer, for the lack of a better term, some editorial comments. Often in our business as firefighters, we complain that politicians don't do enough for us, and perhaps sometimes that criticism may be accurate. However, this is one time Congress has done right by us by creating the National Cancer Registry, and I have to say the enrollment has not been great. I am hopeful after tonight's webinar, you will see just how easy it is to register and why it's important to get registered, and that you will personally get yourself registered and become an advocate for the program and insist that others in your department get registered as well. I recorded a podcast with Alex earlier this month, and we'll provide the links you need to listen to the Station 1902 podcast. You can also review previous webinars at www.providentins.com and using the training resources link in the upper right-hand corner on the page. So as we typically do, a little bit about Provident. Provident started in 1902 as an independent insurance company in the Pittsburgh area. In 1928, a decision was made after they discovered a lot of volunteer firefighters in particular had no income protection if they were injured on the job. They started an accident and health program in 1928. Today, we provide volunteer, combination, and career fire departments and emergency responders with a multitude of programs. We also now offer programs to law enforcement, and we have some other special risk programs. Provident celebrating 6 years as a top insurance employer as awarded by the Insurance Business of America. Our programs, our accident and health program provides coverage for your members if they're doing a fire department sponsored activity and they're hurt on duty. And if you are an accident health client, you and your immediate family members have access to our first responder assistance program, which is kind of like an employee's assistance program that is completely confidential. We also offer a 24-hour accidental death and dismemberment policy, which would provide coverage for your members if they were to die from an accident off duty. We have a group life policy for you and your members, a critical illness and cancer policy that pays a living benefit up to $30,000 if you're diagnosed with cancer, you have renal failure, a heart attack, or a stroke. And then we also have our Fire Plus property and casualty insurance. And if you're a property and casualty client, you have access, excuse me, to our Fire Plus Academy, which is through Fire Rescue One with over 800 courses. Our next webinar will be April the 29th with Dr. Ann Germain, who's going to talk to you about managing acute and chronic sleep problems. I did a podcast with her last month, and I have to tell you, I learned a great deal about how I can deal with some of my chronic sleep problems. I would suggest if you have issues with sleep that you join us on April the 29th. Without further ado, tonight we have the pleasure of having Alex Mayer with us from the CDC NIOSH. He's a health scientist to talk to you about the National Firefighter Cancer Registry. Alex, welcome. And I'm going to turn my camera off.
Fantastic. Yeah, thanks for the introduction, Ed. And yeah, thanks for having me here today. Looking forward to talking through the National Firefighter Registry for Cancer. Just getting my slides up here. Can you all see the slides and hear me all right?
Yes, we can.
Perfect. Thanks, Sam.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, as Ed mentioned, I'm Alex Mayer, and I'm a health scientist working at the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health, or NIOSH. I primarily work on the National Firefighter Registry for Cancer, or NFR, which is what I'm going to be talking about today. But I'm going to start with just a brief background on firefighter exposures to sort of give a background on how we got to the NFR. So as I'm sure many of you are aware, there are over 1.1 million firefighters that protect our homes, communities, and environments across the United States. Those firefighters respond to about 1.4 million fires in the US every year, and about 500,000 of those are structure fires. It's been suggested or thought that about 1 to 5% of a firefighter duties are spent at structure fires, which can equal out to about 20 to 100 hours a year. Additionally, the wildfire season is growing in length and severity. And looking out west, the wildland-urban interface is also increasing as more developments are occurring across the country. Additionally, exposure studies have found that there are hundreds of combustion or compounds released from burning materials during any fire. Over a dozen known carcinogens have been identified on the fire ground, and even more possible or probable carcinogens have been identified as well. Looking at firefighter exposures and specifically what is in structure fires, the materials used in vehicles, homes, and other structures are increasingly becoming synthetic. Specifically, we see polymers, including foams, plastics, and resins. Chemicals are also being added to the products, such as flame retardants, plasticizers, PFAS, which is growing in a growing concern across the fire service and across the country. Additionally, modern structure fires burn much faster than mid-20th century structures. And I have a video I want to show here. We are seeing, less fires across the United States over the last 40 years. But the fires that do happen are burning much faster. And this was a video that was put together by some of our colleagues at UL FSRI. Just sit there. And this video has I'm going to fast forward a little bit, but it has a side-by-side comparison with a natural home furnishings just from the 70s, and then some new home furnishings that are more synthetic. And they started a fire on both areas. And you can see at the beginning, it looks like the fire is more intense in the natural couch. However, around the 2-minute mark, I believe, you start seeing the synthetic material, once it does catch on fire, the fire increases in severity quickly. And I'm just going to fast forward here a little bit, but you can see the time down here at 3 minutes and 30 seconds. We're already approaching flashover at the synthetic material, and the other couch is still slowly burning with the natural. And then fast forward a little bit more, we'll reach flashover about 5 minutes in with this synthetic couch. And this just shows that, the fires that we're dealing with today are very intense and spread much faster than in the past. Back to our slides here. All right, and then this slide here just looks at different compounds that are potentially present during a fire response. Up here, these chemicals, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, as well as volatile organic compounds, or VOCs. These chemicals compounds are present when any organic materials are burned. And some of these are known carcinogens. Down here, we have, the PBDEs, which is a type of flame retardant, as well as PFAS. These are products that may be included in synthetic materials, and they can be released when those synthetic materials are burned. The International Agency for Research on Cancer is a group that classifies the carcinogenicity of different things across the across the world. They have 5 different groups for their classification, including Group 1, known carcinogen, Group 2A, a probable carcinogen, and Group 2B, possible carcinogen, and then there's a 3, not classifiable, and a 4, probably not. For our case today, we're going to primarily focus on these top 3. And looking at what chemicals have been found on the fire ground, we've found 12 known Group 1 known carcinogens during fire responses. When we look at Group 2A, another 6 or 7, and then several Group 2B carcinogens. So it's clear that there are exposures for firefighters when they're responding to fires. And this is an exposure pathway. And again, this was developed by our friends over at UL-FSRI. They do a lot of really great work that I would recommend checking out if you have some time. But this is an exposure pathway diagram that illustrates just how complicated the exposure process can be. It's not just what firefighters may inhale during a response, but also what may contaminate their PPE and equipment, transfer to their skin, off gas from their gear, and so on. And then looking at different potential routes of exposure for firefighters. So traditionally, inhalation is the most direct route of exposure. And this is true not just for firefighters, but for any occupation. For firefighters specifically, the inhalation exposure does depend largely on SCBA use when in the hot zone and the location relative to the fire, whether you've set up command upwind or downwind of the fire. It's important to note that combustion particles are typically in respirable size range, which is smaller, and are able to penetrate lower respiratory systems, and clearance mechanisms are less effective at removing these. Traditionally, the dermal exposure has sort of been secondary when we've thought about firefighter exposures, but a lot of our research over the last decade has found that dermal exposure is probably more important than was previously thought. Looking at some of the chemicals that I mentioned earlier, like PHs, we found that PHs that deposit on the skin can actually be absorbed directly into the skin, about 20 to 50% absorption of PHs after 6 hours. Looking at the type of skin, it's also important for how fast it will absorb. For instance, the neck skin is much thinner than the skin on the bottom of your foot, so it'll be more likely to absorb PHs in the thinner skin areas. And we've done some studies, myself and my supervisor, Dr. Kenny Fent, where we found absorption of PHs even when SCBA has been worn. This suggests that dermal absorption is happening during these fire responses. Additionally, some VOCs or vapors can be absorbed directly by the firefighter. About 1% benzene vapor can be absorbed through the skin. And increased skin temperature, sweat, and humidity can increase absorption. Obviously, we know those 3 things are very common for firefighters responding to a fire. So it's important to know that the dermal absorption is also a primary route for firefighters when responding to fires. And another potential route of exposure is tracking contamination back to the station. There are several contaminants that you might be able to track back to the station, but one that we've looked at that's a pretty persistent chemical are flame retardants, and these have been measured in fire station dust across the country, including brominated and organophosphate flame retardants. Most interestingly, the most abundant congeners in the fire environment have also been found in fire station dust. So this would suggest that what's been found in the fire response is being brought back to the fire station, and the potential to track it not just back to the fire station, but also back to your home. So exposure for firefighters can really vary by several factors. You know, I know we have folks from around the country, and it looks like from around the world in the chat there. But, you know, department type plays an important role, whether you're urban or rural. Geographic location is also important. You know, an exposure for a structural firefighter in Phoenix might be very different than a structural firefighter in Boston, where they have older homes. The type of firefighter, I know that I think a lot of the firefighters on here are volunteer firefighters. That exposure profile might be very different than career firefighters. And it's important to note, I think I'll mention this later, but most of the studies looking at cancer in the fire service have primarily been focused on career structural firefighters. The type of fires that you respond to is also very important, whether you're responding to structural or wildland fires, job assignment during the fire responses, as well as demographics, men versus women, and the potential use of control interventions during responses, whether you're wearing SCBA during overhaul, for instance. There also are very unique or different exposures for some subspecialties of the fire service. I briefly touched on wildland firefighters, but also fire instructors and fire investigators may have unique and different exposures. So that's sort of the exposure background, what firefighters might be exposed to during their responses. This is more of the epidemiology that's gone into looking at cancer in the fire service. So this was a NIOSH firefighter cancer study by Doug Daniels back in 2014. And this was a records-based retrospective cohort study and the largest study of cancer incidence and mortality in the US firefighters to date. Fire department incident records for nearly 30,000 firefighters working between 1950 and 2009 in San Francisco, Chicago, and Philadelphia were linked with cancer registries in 11 states, as well as their death records. And this study found that firefighters had more cancer deaths and diagnoses than the general population. This was primarily due to digestive, respiratory, urinary, and oral cancers. Mortality update published in 2020 also found excess non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, and elevated rates of select cancers were also observed among non-white and female firefighters, but the samples for these types of firefighters were small, and some estimates were not statistically significant, which leads us to wanting to do more research on these populations as well. There have been a couple other case control studies looking at cancer registry data. This first study in 2015 was another NIOSH study looking at occupations identified through cancer registry records. And they found that compared to other patients, patients with melanoma, multiple myeloma, leukemia, and cancers of the esophagus, prostate, brain, and kidney were more likely to be firefighters than not. They also found that non-Hodgkin's lymphoma and cancers of the lung or tongue, testes, and bladder were associated with firefighters and small samples of non-white firefighters. Another study out of the University of Miami in Florida looked at occupation identified from Florida State Fire Marshal's Office in the cancer registry. And they compare to other cancer patients, they found that patients with melanoma, prostate, testicular, thyroid, and late-stage colon cancer in men, as well as brain and thyroid cancer in women, were more likely to be firefighters. So looking through several epidemiological studies that have been conducted over the past, really 2 decades, Grace LeMasters really started this in 2006. But you can see there are several associated cancers that pop up through multiple studies, including testes, prostate, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, bladder, and mesothelioma. So we're seeing sort of consistent findings across the different studies, which would lead us to believe that there is something there, as far as firefighting and cancer being related. And in fact, in 2022, IARC, the same group that classified the carcinogenicity of some of those products of combustion that I mentioned earlier, looked at the occupation of firefighting as a whole and determined that it was a group 1 known carcinogen. This was a weight of evidence, including epidemiological studies, biomechanistic studies, and exposure studies. And this was based on sufficient evidence for mesothelioma and bladder cancer. So the IARC evaluation is certainly an important product of all the research that has been done over the past, few decades. But there's still several knowledge gaps that exist. And there are questions that are difficult to answer unless you have a large and diverse cohort that can be followed over a long period. Some of these questions include what type of firefighting or what about firefighting increases the risk of cancer? Specifically looking at the types and magnitude of the incidents, exposures, and major events for firefighters, as well as looking at chemical and non-chemical risk factors. Also, what factor or how do control interventions play a part in potential cancer risk? I think we give a lot of bad news to the fire service, and I think I mentioned this on the podcast as well. But I hope that we can also find that some of these control interventions that we're recommending are doing some work to reduce cancer risk long term. So hopefully, that's something we may be able to answer through the NFR. Um, Additionally, how does cancer vary across subgroups of firefighters? Obviously demographic subgroups, women and minorities, as well as volunteers and other subspecialties of the fire service, and across the country, rural versus urban. Also, we were interested in looking at different cancer types and rare cancers to be able to prove, that there is an association, or not prove, but to find an association between rare cancers and firefighting. You would need a lot of individuals enrolled in order to make that comparison. So these knowledge gaps contributed to the development of the Firefighter Cancer Registry Act of 2018, which was, as Ed mentioned, a mandate to CDC NIOSH to develop a voluntary registry of firefighters for monitoring and evaluating cancer and cancer risk factors. The goal of the NFR is to track cancer and risk factors over time to better understand the link between workplace exposures and cancer. Our mission for this project is to generate detailed knowledge about cancer and the fire service through a voluntary registry that reflects our nation's diverse firefighters. There are a few different components about how we're going to go through that, or be able to do this process. But the thing that I want to focus on today is component number one, which is collecting self-reported information on workplace and personnel characteristics through an online web portal. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that here in a few minutes. But we will also be in the future obtaining records from some fire departments to track trends and patterns of exposure. And we'll also be linking with health information databases, including cancer registries and the National Death Index. And lastly, we will be making de-identified data available to external researchers. So the big question about this project is who is eligible to participate? The NFR is open to all U.S. firefighters, not just those with cancer. In fact, it's really important to note that all firefighters are strongly encouraged to join the NFR, not just those with cancer. The NFR is more of an exposure registry than a cancer registry, and which is essential for understanding the differences between firefighters that do and do not develop cancer. I do want to mention that it is voluntary participation. Nobody can force you to join, but we do encourage your participation. The project does have an emphasis on women, minority, and volunteer firefighters, and this is because these three specific groups have been historically underrepresented in firefighter health and safety research. Additionally, these three groups were specifically called out in the Firefighter Cancer Registry Act of 2018. While not called out in the act, we are also interested in fire instructors, wildland firefighters, and fire investigators. These are all groups that we know through some of the limited research that's been done that they have unique exposures and potentially might have a different cancer risk than your traditional structural firefighters. For this project, our goal is to enroll 100,000 firefighters across the country. So far, we started enrolling back in April at FDIC last year. Again, my boss, Kenny Fent, was actually on the main stage and talked about the NFR. So if you were at FDIC, you might have seen him up there. But yeah, our goal is 100,000 firefighters. And so far, we've enrolled a little bit over 11,000 firefighters, which I think is really, great progress so far, but we still have ways to go. And now, if you are interested in sort of walking through the process as I'm going through these slides, you're more than welcome to do so. This might be a good time to go to nfr.cdc.gov and start the registration process if you are interested in doing that today. I'll briefly walk through what the registration process looks like here. So you'll visit the web portal link, which is nfr.cdc.gov. Then you'll be asked to confirm your eligibility, which includes you're at least 18 and you have served as a U.S. firefighter. And then you'll create an account through login.gov. We'll then ask you to read and sign a consent form, fill out your user profile, and then complete an enrollment questionnaire, which typically takes somewhere between 30 and 45 minutes to complete. There are several sections, including demographics, work history, health history, and lifestyle. The work history is definitely the most comprehensive part of the questionnaire. So if you've worked at multiple departments or held multiple positions, that may take you a while to complete. But conversely, if you are a younger firefighter or haven't moved around much, you might be able to work through the process fairly quickly. And then there is some supplemental information that we'll be collecting. We will be sending out voluntary follow-up questionnaires in the future. You don't have to do these, and they'll definitely be much shorter. We're shooting for a range of 5 to 10 minutes for these voluntary follow-up questionnaires. But they may, ask more specific questions about your exposures. We'll also be talking with some fire departments and collecting records potentially, and trying to link those records, incident records, with the information that you provide. Lastly, we'll also be linking with exposure tracking applications. These are like NFRs or PEERS out of Washington or PER out of Florida. But these are areas where you can go through and track your exposure after every incident. We'll be talking with them, and if you provide your consent to them, they may be able to share their records with us so we can link that data as well. And these are some of the just slides that are screenshots of the web portal itself. So this is the informed consent, which it takes about 5 minutes to read through this. And at the bottom, there's a place to put your first and last name and acknowledge that you do want to participate. You'll then be taken to a user profile where you ask some information like your first and last name, your residential address, and then about your work status. So if you're a volunteer firefighter, this is where you would mark that you're a volunteer. Next, you'll be taken to the questionnaire, and you'll start the questionnaire in the demographics section. We'll ask some basic information about where you were born, your sex assigned at birth, as well as your race and ethnicity. Then you'll go to the work history section. This is where we'll ask some questions about how long you've worked as a firefighter and how many departments you've worked at. The next section asks for some more specific information about your fire departments where you worked. We do have a record. We cross-referenced NFPA and USFA's fire department list, and we have a record of about 28,000 departments that you should be able to search and autofill from. If your department is not listed, please feel free to reach out to me and we'll try to get it added. So we did the best we could with the resources available, but we still may be missing some departments. So I'll have my email available at the end of this meeting, and feel free to reach out if you don't see your department listed. Next, you'll be taken to the health history section. We asked some questions. We asked for self-reported cancer diagnosis here, and also some information about other comorbidities that are related to cancer. And lastly, we asked some questions about lifestyle, including how often you work out, tobacco use, alcohol use, that type of thing. And it takes a little bit longer than the 5 minutes that I just took to click through those screenshots. But I do think it's really worth your time if you have it to sit down and go through that process. And like I said, I'm happy to stay on and answer questions afterwards if anybody has them. I have a few more slides here I want to go through just to give some more information on the NFR.
Alec, before you go any further, I just want to, if I can, just for all our listeners, when you get the attachments or the email from Sam tomorrow, there will be an attachment in it that will have a worksheet that has all the questions that you could be asked for the registry that you can print out and use as a worksheet. Now, I want you to understand it's nothing more than a worksheet, so you can review it, write down all the information you want to. Then when you go to registry, you already have all the information at your fingertips to make it easier for you when you go to do the registry.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you for that, Ed. And I think that's a great idea. I think that's something we haven't been doing in the past. So we've been sort of making the conference rounds over the past couple months, well, over the last year, and trying to spread the word. But haven't thought about that, about bringing the questionnaire and sharing that so folks are aware of the type of information that we're asking. I think that's a fantastic idea. We may steal that from you, Ed. But yeah, just going back here to the how we're going to actually be determining cancer for firefighters. So obviously, we're asking a question about your self-reported cancer diagnoses, but really the gold standard of how we do cancer incidence, or how we determine cancer incidence across the United States, is by linking participants' information to state and federal records using the individual identifiers over time. So the information that you provide in this questionnaire will have enough information to track your potential cancer diagnoses later on. Cancer is a reportable illness across the United States. This means that if you ever develop cancer, your doctors are required by law to report that up to the state, and the state keeps track of that information for research purposes. So all states and territories have one of these state cancer registries, and these will where we'll be linking to determine cancer incidence, characteristics, and outcomes. And this is, the gold standard of how you would be doing this type of study. But it's also important, if for those firefighters, who don't have cancer now, hopefully you never develop cancer. But if you do in the future, your first thought is not going to be, I need to reach out to NIOSH or the NFR and let them know that I've developed cancer. So this sort of solves that problem. You won't have to think about reaching out to us. You'll have more important things to think about, but we'll still get that information long term. We also will be linking, long term with the National Death Index, and this is a national database of deaths and causes of deaths, and this will be used to determine cancer mortality. And so these are just two different ways that we look at cancer as scientists to try to determine how much more cancer we're seeing for specific populations compared to the general population. I briefly mentioned that we'll be making data available. The Firefighter Cancer Registry Act stipulates two sort of very important but very conflicting things. The first is protecting firefighters' privacy, which is obviously very important to us. We are asking for a lot of personal information and, getting cancer information. So we have obtained an assurance of confidentiality, which is the highest level of protection that the federal government offers projects like this. It essentially means we cannot share your information even under a court order. But the other aspect is that we need to make data collected in the NFR publicly available. So we had to think through how are we going to go about doing this. We will be making de-identified data available through a secure mechanism, and we'll be using something called a Federal Research Data Center, or RDC, to allow other researchers outside the federal government to potentially get access to the data and do an analysis and then take aggregate data out to potentially share in a publication. This is a very secure mechanism, and the folks at the RDCs do a great job checking the data, and we check it before it even leaves our agency to make sure it's de-identified. So what happens after enrollment? And I think this is, a big question for folks. They spend 45 minutes filling out a questionnaire and they want to know what happens after that. So right now we're sort of at the starting line where we're enrolling firefighters in the NFR. And we're collecting information, personal and demographic information, as well as work history and the use of controls and other occupational and non-occupational factors. Next, long-term over the next 10 plus years, we'll be matching to state cancer registries and doing data analyses and writing manuscripts and sharing publications and sharing that with the fire service. We may look at, demographics and regional differences in cancer risks, as well as I mentioned earlier, the impact of job categories and workplace exposures and practices on cancer, and then also the roles of other personal behaviors and conditions in cancer among firefighters. And so this is a very, long-term project. We're hoping over 10, 20 years, we'll be able to have enough information that we can share with the fire service and hopefully show that, a lot of the work that we're doing is reducing cancer in firefighters. And we will, it says 10 years, but we'll also have some initial analyses that we're planning. We will be sharing updates, with the fire service over time as well. So at this point, participation in the NFR is really the key message here. So if you're interested or available, we'd love for you to spread the word, help spread the word about the NFR. We have a lot of really great information and communication materials that have been developed. So feel free to steal this QR code if you want. We have a bunch of videos, brochures, and different materials that you can either share online, or you can print it out and put it up at your department, however you want to get the word out. We would really appreciate it. And additionally, back to, I keep referencing FSRI, but they put out a lot of really great material. Our main focus here, the work that we do here at NIOSH is, and specifically in our branch and our team, is reducing cancer in firefighters. That's the ultimate goal. And I think Gavin Horn and his group, they put together this hierarchy of contamination control in the fire service, a review of the exposure control options that you all have to potentially reduce cancer risk. I also wanted to highlight, they have a training module of cancer risk reduction that I would recommend as well. So some potential interventions that they mentioned in that manuscript and through the module, to potentially reduce inhalation exposures, obviously wearing SCBA is a great solution, establishing hazard zones at the fire scene, setting up command upwind if possible. We understand that's not always a possibility, but just, thinking through that process and trying to do so if it's an option. Rehabbing away from used gear and potentially transporting contaminated gear in encapsulated bags. Diesel exhaust filtration potentially on scene, and then diesel exhaust capture at the station are great options as well. However, a lot of these are, expensive. These are best practices, what you can do, but these may not be, easy, low cost solutions for your department. But I just wanted to mention those. As far as reducing dermal exposure, I think some of these are easier for, an individual or a department to take on. And these include removing gear to minimize cross-contamination, washing skin with soap and water, or using skin cleansing wipes when you're on scene, as well as potentially decontaminating laundering turnout gear after fire responses, showering as soon as possible after the fire, and wearing new particulate hoods as well. And these are some, interventions where we have some data to support that we're seeing some reductions, at least in, the internal dose of some of these carcinogens. So transitional attack, hitting the fire with water prior to entering. We did a study a few years back, and we found that resulted in about a 50% reduction in pHs in urine after fire compared to interior attack. We've also looked at wet soap gross decon after a fire, or preliminary exposure reduction, however you want to call it. We found about an 85% reduction of pHs from the outer shell of the turnout gear. Skin cleansing wipes, we found about a 50% reduction of pHs from the neck area. And we've also found that laundering is very effective at removing pHs from hoods. And then also just thinking about your training exercises, for volunteers, for fire instructors, everybody, judicious use of engineered wood in your fire training. I think a decrease in exposure is still likely, but there are several groups still looking at, the difference between oriented strand board or OSB versus pallet and straw. So, I think the jury's still out on the best practice there. But I think overall, just a judicious use of those products is a good idea. And I think, over the last couple decades, we've made a lot of progress, more awareness on not just cancer, but heart disease, mental health, and other health priorities within the fire service. And, the work that we're doing right now is hopefully going to provide research, providing evidence to support some of the control interventions that are starting to pop up now. And I think a lot of departments across the country are implementing new effective policies and procedures. And, some of these documents are available, like the Lavender Report and Healthy In, Healthy Out. I think these are great tools that you can, take to potentially share at your department. I think trying to take a dense scientific manuscript may not be the best way to get the word out, but I think they've done a really nice job sort of summarizing some of the results in these materials. And with that, yeah, I'm happy to take any questions here. This link here, if you have your phone up, you can take this QR code, and this takes you directly to nfr.cdc.gov. And again, this is my contact information. My email is nru1@cdc.gov. So as I mentioned, if you have any questions and you'd like to reach out, I'd be happy to chat with you. If you find your department's not listed or you have something to say about the questionnaire, I'd be happy to chat as well. And I'm also happy to take some questions here. So thanks so much for having me today.
Okay, for our listeners, we have questions. We're going to get to them, I promise you. So I just want to make, so I don't forget it. The PowerPoint that Alex presented will be sent to you as an attachment tomorrow in a PDF. So all those links will be available tomorrow to you in the PDF. Sam will also put them in the thank you for joining us email that you'll receive tomorrow. So the links will be readily available. So Alex, I want to walk through with myself. We'll use myself as an example, okay?
Sure.
So to make sure folks really understand this. So late last year, earlier this year, I registered in the Firefighter Registry. So here several months ago, after a long discussion with an environmental health doctor with the Veterans Administration, they agreed to let me get a low-dose CT scan on my chest, which I didn't realize would include the thyroid. And lo and behold, as a result of that, they found 2 nodules on my thyroid. So I've had 2 long needle biopsies done so far and all the blood work done, and it has shown that there's no cancer there. Okay, so far, good news. Later in June, I go see another doctor and an endocrinologist that they're going to do more testing to see whether or not I may have hyper or hypothyroidism. But my point in all this is that if a year from now, because I'm in the National Registry, if a year from now, if my doctor diagnoses me with thyroid cancer, it gets reported to the state. Eventually, that information between what's in your registry and what the state has will link the fact that Ed Mann from Pennsylvania is in a registry, was diagnosed with thyroid cancer. Is that a simple breakdown of how it'll work?
I couldn't have said it better myself, Ed. Yeah,
Okay.
I think we could have skipped the 35 minutes. I think that was good.
Well,
Yeah,
I just want to make sure I want to make sure
Yeah.
our listeners understand, because
Right.
as I told you, I had a conversation with some pretty well-to-do fire chiefs, and they thought they were going to have to put all kinds of medical information into the system, and they had no idea that there's a thing called a state cancer registry. So the idea behind this is that you get registered. So if you develop cancer now, 10 or 15 or 20 years from now, and your doctor reports it to the state registry, now we have a link. So maybe, well, I'll use Central Pennsylvania. Let's say 10 years from now, there are 35 firefighters who end up with a similar cancer that were active in the fire service at the same period of time. Well, now there's a cluster. Hey, what happened in Central Pennsylvania between this date and this date that we have 35 firefighters from the same geographical area who've developed the same cancer? I mean, I guess I'm looking long-term with this and the nuts and bolts of just how great this is. And then on top of that, as I see it, what it helps us with is when we have to do battle with those people who are opposed to cancer presumption laws, attorneys who fight at every corner on a cancer presumption. Now we have data that we can arm those attorneys who represent us with to say, hey, look, here's, we've been doing this cancer registry now for 5 years or however long it might be. And look how many firefighters have developed cancer and these types of cancers over this period of time. And I think that's why it's important for our listeners to understand just how important the system is.
Couldn't agree more. And yeah, thank you for that. And
I don't want to get on a soapbox. I just want to make sure our listeners really understand how important this is and why it's so important to the fire service that we pay attention to this. So, all right, I want to go through the chat first because I know we had a question here.
And while you're looking through there, I did just want to mention, Ed, to your point about, potential clusters or exposures, our team actually went out to Maui and did some biomonitoring of firefighters who responded to the wildfire response. And while we were there, we also asked them, if they wanted to enroll in the NFR, and we had a really good participation in that. So I think that'll be helpful to your point. Long term, we'll have the data to look at that and see if, we're seeing increased cancer risk with some of those unique exposures.
Okay, now I know I saw a question in the chat. Now I'm trying to find it. Let me see if I can find it. There was one of the questions was related to what studies or what are we finding about the exposure to lithium-ion batteries?
Ed, I see it. It's from Steven. It says, do you have any data on chemical exposures from lithium-ion fires?
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, that's a great question. And we're very limited on our information from lithium-ion battery fires right now, but I'm actually working on a project with FSRI, Gavin Horn and Richard Kessler are doing electric vehicle fire tests. So we have electric vehicle fires that we're igniting in an indoor facility, and we're characterizing airborne and wipe samples during those responses at simulated firefighter locations. And we're doing a lot of those combustion products that I mentioned on the slides earlier, PHs, VOCs. So we'll have some, there's not a lot of information on those exposures at this point. So we're characterizing the exposures now. That's sort of the first step. We'll be able to compare that with your more traditional internal combustion engine or ICE vehicles, as well as structure fires, and sort of place it in the literature. What type of exposures are we seeing for these type of fire responses? Next, I think we're very interested, we're working on an EV work group with USFA, where we're looking at, next steps. And I think we want to look at, what are the gear cleaning processes for these for these exposures. We've heard from a lot of anecdotally from firefighters or fire departments that the gear has a certain smell from these exposures that won't be removed even after multiple cleanings. So we want to see, what potential chemicals are on there, because we don't know what we're looking for yet, but we're hoping to identify that, and we'll be sharing that with the fire service, soon. So I think be on the lookout for that report. That'll be probably led by Gavin or Richard, but that'll be coming out from FSRI probably 6 to 9 months from now would be my guess.
Okay, and we have a webinar coming up in probably a couple of months with Chris Paff, who's one of our returning speakers. That's going to actually, apparently his group is doing some work with TEEX on the same thing. And he's going to share some of their initial findings and some of the things they found out from some of their initial testing. So as you said, Alex, it's still something that's being studied, and keep your eyes open for the information. I mean, that's one thing I think the fire service has to realize and remember. The scientific and the research community in the last 10 years has done so much for the fire service. that, you know, cancer presumption laws would not be where they are right now had it not been for the research that's been done by people like you and all the others that are doing this research on our behalf. So we do have another question here. Maria Meyer asked a question, is there a measurable difference for industrial firefighters?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that's one of those, I could have listed those in the subspecialties there where we don't have enough information. I don't want to say there's no information, but to my knowledge, I haven't seen a lot published on looking at industrial firefighters. So I think that's certainly, if you know industrial firefighters or you are an industrial firefighter, we would really recommend you participate in the NFR, and hopefully long term we can look at that as well. But I personally don't know of any studies looking at them, but I don't want to speak for.
Right, well, correct me if
everyone.
I'm wrong, and if I'm wrong, please tell me so. But even if you don't fight fire anymore, if you were a firefighter, even for a year, you can register in the registry, correct? You don't have to currently be an active firefighter. You might be retired like I am. You're not chasing fire trucks anymore.
That's a great point. So we'll take anybody who's eligible from their first day as a new recruit. We've been with some new recruits who've signed up on their first day to retired firefighters. Everybody is eligible to participate.
And I know we have some folks on from Pennsylvania and other states with junior firefighters. Right now, the minimum age to register is 18. So those of you who are 14 to 17, you're going to have to wait a year till you turn 18, but then you can get registered. So I just wanted to make, so for those of you volunteer or career departments, reach out to your former firefighters and get them registered. I mean, and to your point earlier, if you've only ever belonged to one fire department, it won't take you that long to do it.
Right.
Let's make sure I don't have any other questions in the chat.
Paul Giuliano asked one at the bottom, Ed.
Well, I'm getting there.
Okay.
I'm using my cutoff finger to get there, Sam. Give me a minute. Is there a chance? Well, we have one from Scott D. Is there a chance or a timeline when non-US firefighters will be added?
Yeah, that's a great question. We currently, because this is congressionally funded, it is limited to United States firefighters. But we are in conversations with a group in Canada and as well as a group in the UK and Australia, who are all interested in setting up a similar registry to follow their firefighters. So our questionnaire, all of our information is publicly available. And we've been recommending that these other institutions in other countries use our questionnaire. I'm the same one that Ed is going to send out to mimic those questions, so that way we'll be able to compare data sets across the countries. So we'll see if they, take us up on that, but that's sort of our idea at this point.
Great. So we do have a question from Paul Giuliano. Do you have to have your department's permission to register, being fire department records are required?
Yeah, so no, we do not have to have you do not have to have your department's permission to register. The department records are not required. That would be sort of a subcomponent. So we won't have fire department records for every single firefighter. We'll choose some specific departments and request the records from those departments. And whether they decide to participate or not, will be up to the department. But you as an individual are free to participate.
All right. So to Kip Hayford, Kip, I hope the weather's good in Erie County and you're not snowed in. Do you think the state fire instructors will be required to register? Alex, to your point earlier, there is no requirement to register. So I don't think even as a state instructor in Pennsylvania, the fire commissioner could require you to register, but it would certainly be in your best interest to register. I mean, Kip, that's one of the reasons it took me an hour and a half to do the registry. Having been a military firefighter, I had to list all the military bases I was on, all the work I've done as an instructor in, Wyoming, Florida, South Dakota, my time in Okinawa, the 4 years in Europe. So it took me a while just because I had all that work stuff I had to put into the system to cover all the jobs I've done in the fire service. So I think we've covered everything in the chat. Let's go to the Q&A and see what we have over there. All right. Has there been any discussion to link NFR with the upcoming NIOSH platform, allowing firefighters to link the NFR profile to their NIOSH personnel records, which would allow for automatic response data import? Interesting question.
Yep, and so Kenny Fent, my supervisor, is on the NARIS committee, and so we are definitely involved with them, and we are hoping that's part of our plan long term, is to be able to link with NARIS and other exposure tracking applications. Any way where we can facilitate the ease of transfer of records would be ideal. And we are actually, I should have mentioned this in the presentation. But we are now providing a participant ID to each individual. And that is, sort of forward thinking. That's the way that we will link the individual, in a few years, if NARIS is up and running and we need, you consent through NARIS to share your records, you can provide your participant ID from the NFR, and then we'll be able to accurately link the information using that participant ID.
Great. So the next question is from Jim. Would it be possible to use the PowerPoint to educate students as I teach programs, or a reduced version of this? Thank you.
Yeah, I think the plan, as I understand it, was for this PowerPoint to be shared after tomorrow potentially. So that would be great if you want to use those slides to educate other students. And if you have any other questions or would like we have different versions. I've given anywhere from a 30-second pitch on this to, a 2-hour talk. So we have different, materials ready. So if you're interested, Jim, feel free to reach out to me via email, and I'm happy to, share anything with you.
And we'll have a link to the CDC NIOSH page that'll take you to the National Fire Registry. And there's a ton of different links in there for all kinds of material that you can download. There's videos, there's brochures you can download as well. So, and that link will be in the email that you get from Sam tomorrow. Dave Lindsay, is there info brochure one could take to the doctor during physical wellness visits for suggestions to the doctor to add these visits? Sam will attach the physician's checklist to the email tomorrow.
Yep, I'll make sure to do that.
Yeah, we have a good copy of that, and the most updated one that we share quite often when people ask for it. And the bottom line is, if you take it to your doctor, and this is to you volunteers as well, you need to make sure your doctor understands you're involved in the fire service. Take that physician's checklist with you. And if you have any kind of relationship with your primary care doctor, they'll take the time to listen to what you have to say. I had to switch primary care doctors. She was all over it. She's kept a copy of it. And she said anytime she talks to a firefighter from now on, now in my area, we're all volunteers, so it's going to be difficult for her to identify. So I'm telling you, if you're involved in the fire service, make sure your doctor's aware of the fact that you're a firefighter and take that checklist with you. I had some problems here last year. I had to see a urologist, and I'll share this with you all. I had a lump on my one testicle, scared the heck out of me. I thought I had testicular cancer. When I met with the urologist the first time, he had no idea that firefighters had a greater risk of testicular cancer than the general population. The occupational health doctor I talked to at the Veterans Administration, she had no idea about the increased risk of cancer, especially thyroid cancer among firefighters. A 30-minute conversation with her, and she agreed to let me get a low-dose CT scan. And that's where they found the nodules on my thyroid. So, Make sure your healthcare provider knows you're a firefighter, and Sam will include that in the email tomorrow, so you'll have that checklist with you. Okay, there's one last question we're going to get from Stephen Brock. It just popped up. Recently, a Homeland Security Subcommittee hearing, a fire chief testified that PFAS from lithium-ion fires are not removed even with specialized facility services. There is a 4% failure rate of testing after cleaning bunker gear must be destroyed. Have you any further information on PFAS and the difficulty in removing it from gear?
Yeah, I
That's a
know
damn
that's
good.
yeah, it is. And that's certainly a hot topic right now. I know there's a lot of research being conducted looking at the PFAS in gear. I know NIST just shared a report recently about the amount of PFAS in gear and, how much is being released after it's gone through abrasions and heating. It does look like the amount of PFAS that's in a gear might be increasing after repeated abrasions or heating, just because the gear is breaking down and potentially allowing those PFAS to be extracted. And that might potentially expose a firefighter too. So there needs to be a lot more research on that topic right now. I will say, looking at any sort of fire response, when you go into a structural fire response, you're likely going to be exposed to PFAS through what's in the room and contents, the home furnishings as well. So there's a potential that PFAS might be on the gear, even if we do have PFAS-free gear. That's not to say that, we should be looking at ways of reducing PFAS or removing it if there are safe alternatives out there. But yeah, I don't have a personal stance one way or the other. Just, I think we need to keep collecting the data and trying to see the best path forward.
I know one of the studies that's being done in North Carolina by one of the universities that came out during the Cancer Alliance meeting.
Right.
They're suggesting with new turnout gear that still has the PFAS in it when you buy it, that you wash it several times before you wear it. You don't just simply take it out of the bag and put it on new. And obviously, they've also suggested you limit the amount of time in your turnout gear. Now, that doesn't mean, listen to me, it doesn't mean you take it off during the fire, okay, or during overhaul. It's when you're hanging out at the station, when you're washing trucks, that kind of stuff. Take the turnout gear off until there's more study done on this. Well, I believe one of the things I heard was when they tested the gear that doesn't have the PFAS, they found out that a lot of, I think they took some diesel fuel and put some of it on the turnout gear, and they found that it actually leaked all the way through. There would have actually made it through to your skin. So you give up one thing, you lose something else. So there's still a lot of work to be done with turnout gear and PFAS. So before I forget, before I go on, and then I'll ask you to do a show of hands. I have a 2.5 hour program on good, better, best practices for reducing cancer risk. I could narrow it down to a little more than an hour if you, through a show of hands, if you'd be interested in me doing a webinar with that, throw your hands up and we'll do a webinar sometime in the next couple of weeks. We don't have to ask anybody else to help us with it. I hear a bunch of popping, so I'm assuming. Sam, can you count hands that are popping up, or am I just hearing something in my ear?
Oh, yeah. On my end, it looks like we're 22.
Okay. So I think what we'll do here sometime in the next couple of weeks, I'll work with Sam since he does our marketing. I can do, and then I'll make this offer too. I can deliver the entire program in person, but it makes it easier for me to convince my boss to travel somewhere to do it if you're a client. So I'll just throw that out. But Sam and I will work on getting it advertised, and I'll do a shortened version, the 2.5 hour good, better, best practices on cancer risk reduction, since we had this discussion tonight. I don't see any other questions in the QA. I don't see any more in the chat. So Alex, I want to thank you for providing some excellent information tonight. I'm hopeful our listeners will get registered and become advocates for the National Firefighter Cancer Registry. I'd like to see some of the fire chiefs that are on here tonight do mass registration with their firefighters. I want to remind our audience there'll be a short survey we would like you to complete. Keep an eye open in your email from me that'll have your certificate of attendance attached for tonight's webinar. Again, tonight's episode will be uploaded to providentins.com. You'll receive that link in the email within the next day. Please make sure you check your spam or junk email before you email me and say you haven't received your certificate yet. Also, when you registered, if you put in the wrong email address, don't blame me if your certificate doesn't get there. For those of you who use the webinar as training for a group of people, when you receive the thank you for joining us email from Sam, there'll be an Excel spreadsheet attached. Please use that spreadsheet to send the names and email addresses for me to use for certificates. It just makes life easier for me when I'm doing the certificates. We'll also be attaching a document that will provide you with the information you'll need to complete your registration on the National Cancer Registry. Please note, this is only a worksheet. You'll still have to log into the registry to actually complete your registration. Please join us on April the 29th at 7 p.m. when Dr. Ann Germain will join us for the First Responders Guide to Managing Acute and Chronic Sleep Disorders. Until then, stay safe for your family's sake.
Thanks.